Buenas noches o buenas tardes, noches. Gracias a todos por haberse acercado hasta aquí.
Good evening and thanks for joining us here on this day, on this rainy day. We're fortunate enough to have Ralph Rugoff today with us. He's the new artistic director and curator of the next Bienniale in Venice. We are sponsored by several museums and foundations and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with the University of Tres de Febrero. It all started with an initiative from our colleagues, so we thank her. It's always wonderful to show how different institutions can work in collaboration. This is an open conversation with Ralph. Checking 1, 2, 3. Are you receiving the translation?
It works? ¿Funciona?
Yes, checking 1, 2, 3, checking.
Esto, la ley de Murphy nunca falla. Esto es así.
Checking 1, 2, 3. Is it working now? 1, 2, 3, checking.
It works? Okay.
All right. It's working now.
¿Está bien?
Are we good? Yes?
Muy bien.
All right.
Bueno, entonces, decíamos que la dinámica va a ser la del diálogo.
So this is an open conversation, and I will ask the first few questions, just an icebreaker, and then we'll open the floor for comments and questions to the audience. Ralph speaks English, of course. We have simultaneous interpretation. We can speak any of the two languages, English and Spanish, and we are currently streaming in the two languages. So make sure you only speak English. And now, to open up with a conversation, I want to go back to something that Ralph, as director of Hayward Gallery, stated in an interview just recently. He said that the audience needs to know that they are part of the conversation. This statement speaks of a policy on the audience and a strategy to choose artists and how you build an exhibition. It talks about a stance as a curator, as a director. We share this belief and these ideas, but we want you to develop these ideas. How do you bring that to practice? And considering another of your statements I've read about, where you said that the Hayward Gallery has a radical democratic view connected with the outside world, and it's adventurous, you stated. So maybe I would like you to start with your comments on strategies you follow as a director of the gallery, how you develop programs that meet with this mission of being connected with the outside world, of being democratic, and sharing this adventurous spirit as well.
First, I apologize for not speaking Spanish, but unfortunately, when I was young, I made the mistake of studying French at school instead of Spanish. You know, the Hayward, I wish I had a picture that I could show you of the Hayward Gallery up there. But it was a building that was designed in the mid-1960s by a committee really of 5 architects commissioned by the City of London. And they were a very radical group of architects. Some of them went on to join a group called Archigram, which is well known for being what's called a paper architecture group or theoretical architecture, but one of the radical architecture groups of the 1960s. And with the Hayward, they made a very experimental brutalist building. I think there are many different kinds of brutalism, and we often talk about brutalism as if it was one label for many different approaches. And I think this was an experimental, very individual type of brutalism, kind of a Baroque brutalism. But one of the features of the building, several features of the building, one was there were pedestrian bridges that linked to the city bridges, like Waterloo Bridge, which the Hayward is next door to. They linked over to a railroad bridge on another side. There were many ways to come into this Hayward Gallery area. And even though it's in London, where it rains 260 days a year, they made outdoor sculpture terraces, big, 3 of them around the outside of the building, where you would go to look at things outside. And of course, if it's raining, that's not so useful. But there was a sense that they wanted to have exhibition spaces that were visible to people who might not ever come into the building. And so a lot of the work we've done, some of the most interesting work, I think, has been projects that are on those spaces that are great for people who come into the exhibition, but also they're available to people who don't come into the exhibition. And finally, you know, they had big windows in the upstairs. The downstairs looks like a nuclear fallout shelter, and that it's very, you know, no windows. You're in a bunker environment, but it's very creative space. But in the upstairs, in the 1960s, people weren't putting big windows in museums. And their idea was that you should be looking out at the city so you know where you are. You're part of, you don't get lost in some secret world of art, but you are you're brought again to contextualize where your experience is taking place. Another thing they did, which is very interesting and sometimes drives our curators crazy, is that they designed the building so that it's impossible to have just one route through the space. There's a front stairs, there's a back stairs, it's on 2 levels, and the galleries have different points where you can cross over from one to the other. And it's a very open plan. And they wanted to prevent the kind of exhibition making where you have to go in a certain order through the exhibition. And this is what most big galleries are like now. Even interesting ones like Tate Modern, every exhibition has the same path. And there's only one way to go through it. You don't have a choice. So through the architecture, they wanted to give everyone the choice of how they went through the exhibition space. So this kind of thinking, which is built into the architecture, and it's very interesting how much architecture can affect exhibition making, is sort of a point of inspiration for trying to do something that I've always been interested in, which is just this idea which many people have had in the 20th century, that art is a conversation, that it's not, that the person who's looking at the art has to interpret it, because the meaning of art is open. So that means this exchange occurs, and that the meaning of that exchange changes with context, with audience, many factors, but it's not static. So that each visitor who comes is contributing to this conversation. And I think a lot of institutions don't make a point of highlighting that aspect of art. And they have a wall label for each work. It tells you exactly what that work of art means. You have no work to do as a visitor. It's all been decided before you got there, right? You just have to admire how great it is and how smart the people in the institution were because they presented this show for you. So I think, we still have a long way to go before we're making exhibitions that are really more in this spirit of the openness of art. People in institutions often try to fix things in place too much.
Es muy interesante esto, ya que forma.
This is so interesting. Here we have, can you hear me?
Decía que
This
es muy
is so
interesante
interesting.
este planteo. En la sala hay muchos estudiantes
Here
de la
in the
maestría en
room, we have
curaduría y
many
muchas
students
veces
in
ponemos
the
en discusión
masters on
otras
curators,
exposiciones o las
and
exposiciones que
I know
estamos llevando adelante
that
y los
many
lugares
expositions and the
de
shows they try to
las
create are
obras y el lugar
such.
de los textos. Que yo
They talk
coincido
about the
con
place of
restar
work
espacio a
and
los
the
textos y
place
dar
of
más espacio a
text.
las obras
They
y
said,
generar
we usually
estrategias
say
para
that we
que
need
las
more
obras
space for works
inviten a
and
hacer
less
el
for
ejercicio que
text.
nosotros hacemos,
The
que es
work
pensar
should
con
be
ellas y que inviten al público
requesting
a
for
pensar con las
interpretation,
imágenes,
invite
a
the
generar otras
audience to
circulaciones. Sin
create
embargo,
new
esto
meanings by
del
circulating
otro
around the
lado
works of
está
art.
la posición que
But then on the
sostiene
other
que
side,
estos
you have
espacios tienen
another
una misión
position where they
didáctica.
say that
Ahí
these
entramos en la tensión entre construcción de
institutions are
conocimiento y construcción de
educational
pensamiento.
centers. But this is where we come to
Yo
this
voto por
idea
la
of
construcción del pensamiento y
constructing
entiendo que
and
su planteo
building
va por ese
thought
mismo
and
lado.
building education. I mean, these are different things.
I mean, I think it's very important to share information, and sometimes, which is different from delivering an interpretation at an institutional, official interpretation. So you might share information with some of the things that inspired an artist, some of the background to their work, some of the things they were exploring, some of the information they were, had dug up in some way or other. But you don't have to interpret it. So in a way, the ideal wall label would just be some questions. Or my dream, and I have to see if I can get away with this in Venice, is you actually have 2 or 3 different wall labels that offer completely different interpretations of the same work. And then you make it very clear that there's no one way.
Cada uno arma su propio catálogo.
We each create our own. We each create our own catalog.
I mean, as human beings, our perception is incredibly subjective. And you read the same text to 5 different people, they all hear something slightly different. So we might as well have some fun with this.
Esta perspectiva que
This perspective that you propose has to do with a reflection on the institution itself, museum, exhibition place, exhibition devices. And this translates into the large institutions as biennales. What are your thoughts on the Biennale as an institution per se? As a curator, you might have another position, but trying to review the theory and criticizing biennales, what do you think?
I really do think that there's over 300 biennales in the world now. So what was once an unusual event has now become a ritual that feels redundant sometimes. But I think it's only redundant if you're taking the position of some international, arts professional who's going around and traveling and seeing lots of them. I think a very important part of the Biennale is that its local impact. And for me, and all due respect to the Biennale Sur, which I know you have a different model for, but you know, a Biennale, who's the audience? And to me, that's usually a local audience. Sometimes it's a national audience, for if it's something like Sao Paulo Biennale. But the international component is a pretty small percentage of the total audience that comes. So I think you always have to think, who is this Biennale for? So for me, I'm not really interested in making a Biennale that's for my fellow curators or the artists I think are cool or, you know, special critics. I really am making it for the people who come. And you want to, you know, but I think, so I can't judge in a general Biennale critique or critique the critiques. I do think it's generally a horrible idea to do anything every 2 years without questioning why you're doing it. So maybe there should be many more, what do you call something that happens every 10 years? A decimale. I want to curate actually the centenale that would only happen once every 100 years. That's one of my dreams.
Sin embargo.
Nonetheless, however, you are having the perspective of taking over the curatorship of the Venice Biennale. So that gives you some sort of perspective of this biennial sequence of the rituals proper of biennales, and that of Venice being the oldest one, the one that invented the format and changed it over time, is in turn the one that imposes a number of rules that have to be faced up in order to challenge them or to follow them, but these are the rules it has. Regarding the audience that you were mentioning, at the same time, there is a global circuit that the public of the Venice Biennale, this audience may be difficult to conceive or to formalize in a way.
Yeah, I think there's a global public that's largely takes access to it through press, through social media postings, that there's a diffusion of any exhibition that way. And I do think that the conversation is international, and that's what's important, and that the cities that host these things, yeah, the people who go are largely from that country and from that city. But I think it's important that they're participating in an international conversation, but it's a conversation with international artists, not necessarily with lots of other countries. Can you repeat?
La primera parte.
The first part of my comment had to do with beyond the desire of being the curator of 100 years exhibition, of exhibitions that repeat themselves every 100 years, you have been appointed a Biennale, the Venice Biennale, that has been up and running for over 100 years, and this presents a number of rules.
With Venice, the rules are changing. They change all the time. And what was fascinating for me to learn was that until 1970, all the work at the Biennale was for sale. So the Venice Biennale was like a huge marketplace. And that was partly how they paid for it. Now, it's very interesting. This year, for the first time, they've changed the rules about crediting sponsorship, so that nobody will get any credit on the wall labels by the artworks. And of course, many sponsors are going to be very upset to know that they're not going to it's not making my job easier. But they really felt that it had looked like it was becoming too much dependent on commercial gallery support, because all the labels were mentioning thank you to this big gallery, thank you to that big gallery. And because of the popularity of the Biennale, it has gone up every year in the last decade. They're generating more revenue from tickets. So they don't need as much support as they used to need. But I think in terms of it's very interesting, this word Biennale, which really just means something that happens every 2 years. But we know that now it means some big, sprawling international exhibition also. But I almost have trouble thinking of it as an exhibition. Venice is unique among all the biennales because it has this curated international component, and that's the part I'm doing, but it also has 80 national pavilions. So it's a model that goes back to the early 19th century, to the great expositions, and I think it's an interesting tension to have in an exhibition, because the international exhibition is very much a utopian concept. It's that we can have this free cultural exchange between all the countries in the world, and that art is the place that allows that to happen. But of course, we don't live in a borderless world. And the national pavilions reestablish the idea of national borders and hegemony and national sovereignty. And I think it's interesting to have the two of them together. But what's crazy is that it all goes under the same title. It's not one exhibition. So as an exhibition format, I think it's very difficult. Also, simply on the basis of size. You know, if you enjoy seeing movies, for instance, would you like to go to a movie festival where you had to watch 80 hours of movies in a row without stopping? Because that's sort of what Biennale offers to the public. I mean, more work, more than you can take in, possibly. I know I probably sound like I'm a funny person to be organizing a Biennale, but I think I'm slightly, you know, I'm not, yeah, it's a mixed bag.
Sí, es verdad. Es verdad que presenta esta dificultad.
It is true that there's this difficulty and the coexistence of an old model that is seen in national pavilions and a model that gets to change over time. But national pavilions got to change as well based on the strategies, the French with the German, and alternating artists and spaces with one another in some of the editions, or calling in artists from other nationalities to use up their spaces. I believe that these are different gestures that aim at modification. And we cannot but ask you something about the theme that you've chosen for your Venice Biennale 2019. And this was the motivation of this. What was that motivated you to choose that theme?
I definitely am of the school that a Biennale should take this time frame seriously, so that because it's something that happens every 2 years, it's a kind of clock or mechanism for looking at the time that you're in. And so I think it should reflect this period that we're living through. And I guess one of the things that seemed most interesting to me about this period is the rise of, you know, what they call in the United States fake news, or which, in a truly Orwellian phrase, one of President Trump's associates called alternative facts, right? So if the president's lying, well, it's an alternative fact. Okay, now, well, I believe very much in the idea that with art, we have to make our own interpretation. Art is a special category of human communication. The artwork, ideally, is an open text. Many things in life are not open text. There are facts. I believe in facts. So this idea of alternative facts and the role that this has played in political life now, it always has played a role, but it's become exacerbated partly through the internet and social media. And the dream of the internet as a place that would make information free, we forgot that it also makes disinformation free. And that all the disinformation in the world can suddenly get mixed up with the useful information. We don't have a way to filter that necessarily. And that tribes develop. People only get news because you can filter out exactly what you want to get. That reinforces your point of view that you already have. So people become more and more isolated from each other in these information bubbles. So this seemed to me like one thing I wanted to be able to talk about. And so this title, I also just think, yeah, we live in a time that I think has many very serious challenges, and I find it quite an alarming time, a very disturbing time. Around the world, there's been a resurgence of almost neo-fascist politics, nationalist politics. In the UK, we saw Brexit, and Brexit got people to vote for it because of outrageous lies that politicians told, and which they recanted the day after the vote. They said, you know what, everybody, we lied, but now it doesn't matter because you voted for Brexit. And so it's very tricky position, I think, for this open type of play with meaning that is art, in a moment where there's a rather insidious play with ideas about the truth. And the idea that maybe there are just alternative facts and everyone can have their own opinion. And there's an interesting French sociologist named Bruno Latour who he spent most of his life critiquing the authority of science and scientific institutions. But then in 2005, he wrote a very interesting paper saying that the right wing had co-opted his strategy of trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of scientific organizations, because they were all denying climate change. And their argument was simply, there's no certainty. Scientists can't be absolutely sure about climate change. Nobody can guarantee this 100%. So don't assume that, we can't pretend that this is really true. So there's been a kind of rhetorical reversal where the instruments of critique have now been used to discredit legitimate science. So this title, May You Live in Interesting Times, one, I think we live in interesting times, but they're rather frightening times in some ways, but maybe every time feels that way, I mean, it's funny, I went back and I read the descriptions of different biennales that the curators wrote, their statements. Almost every one is saying, we're living in a crisis. It's a terrible crisis right now, right? And this biennale has to talk about this crisis. And I thought, wow, okay, we live in a perpetual crisis. So let's deal with that state of permanent crisis rather than this urgency that this is a special crisis right now, and I'm going to bring together the artists who will save the world. But this phrase, "May you live in interesting times," is a fake phrase that it was presented as an ancient Chinese curse in Western discourse. I think it was invented by an English diplomat. But many famous politicians have ended up making references to it, famous writers, science fiction authors. And the idea that this was a curse because interesting times were times of precariousness, times of danger, war, revolution, famine, whereas a stable period is boring because nothing's changing. Now I think we're living in interesting times in the sense of this curse, but I wanted it to have a dual meaning, that we can't just feel horrible and panic. We have to see that actually maybe there are interesting opportunities at the same time, but that it takes paying attention, which hopefully if it's interesting, you will pay attention. But it's important to me that this is a counterfeit cultural artifact, because that's a reference to this larger change that I think we've been seeing.
That's quite an interesting concept, such as interesting are the times. I'd like not to use the microphone on my own, but open up to comments that I guess are on top of everybody's minds. And there's an initial question from the floor. So let's open up to the dialogue. Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you, Diana. Thanks, Ralph Rugoff. My question has to do with the motto or the theme that you picked, "May you live in interesting times." Is there any expectation on your part so that national artists will engage in that dialogue with this theme, or will you render them completely free and independent?
I only laughed because, as far as I can tell, I've never before, maybe I've been to, I don't know, 8 or 9 biennales, I've never noticed that the artists in the national pavilions ever paid any attention to the theme. And I only heard of this idea when I was appointed, and in the office in Venice, they explained to me that this is how it works. And I really wasn't sure that that happens. But it'd be great if anybody wants to. But obviously, I think people just do what they want to do.
That's quite interesting, because the first few biennales I visited, I always thought everything was part of the same theme. And many times I wondered, why is it that this pavilion has this piece that has nothing to do with the theme, that is totally unrelated? But given the variety of concept, there might have been some that had some connection, at least in my mind. And ambiguity grew stronger. This is what's interesting in working with this subject matter, where the interpretation allows us to focus on things in such a variety of ways.
I mean, I think the nature of the process, that each national pavilion has a curator who works with an artist, and why would they want to just follow your idea? I probably get in big trouble for saying this when the people in Venice find out what I'm saying, but because we're supposed to encourage everybody to respond to the theme. And I think one good thing about this very general theme I have is that it's so general, I think it can look more like more of the work maybe has a connection to it.
Sí. Sebastián.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hello.
Estuve leyendo el
I've been
texto
reading
introductorio
the
a la
introductory
Bienal
text to the Biennale,
noté que en un momento usted
and I
habla
noticed that
de
at
la
one
posibilidad
point
del
you
arte como un
speak
método,
of art
o
as
sea, como
method,
un poco como comparándolo o haciendo una
comparing it,
analogía con el
maybe
método
drawing
científico.
analogies with the
Hay
scientific
una mención a
method.
esta idea
You
del
mentioned
método
this idea
del
of
arte,
the
como un
method of
método
art,
de
the artistic
investigación, como una forma
method
de
as a research
acercarse a
method, as
investigar
a
sobre un
way
problema.
of
Me gustaría saber
investigating on a given
si
subject
usted
matter.
tiene como
I
una idea
want
un
to
poco
know,
más elaborada
do you have a more elaborate idea on that of art and art as a method?
I probably wouldn't use the word method. I think I said something more like art can be a guide for maybe how we think and live in the world. But I wouldn't say there's one method. I mean, for me, maybe there's a general rule, though, which is that the most interesting art for me always tries to sit in between our existing definitions of some kind. And it does that partly, or as a result of doing that, it calls those definitions into question. Because if we have categories that can't account for something, maybe there's something wrong with those categories and that kind of thinking. So, you know, art does this in many, many different ways. Sometimes it does it because it seems to take from different genres and mix them in a way where you're not sure which genre it belongs to. It might be something that seems to be both ugly and beautiful at the same time, right? I mean, organic and geometric. There are many, many artists throughout the last 100 years of art who've talked very much about this idea of trying to defy classification and defy categorization. And I think that's where, say, art's very different from science or even a lot of philosophy, other forms of thought, except for deconstructive philosophy, because I think art is deconstructive that way. It's trying to break down the habits, the categories, the classifications that we already have and we assume describe the world completely.
Can I ask the question in English, please? I'd like to ask the question in English.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's also my native language.
Okay.
I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on the idea of a presentation or the Biennale being an open book, open for interpretation. As you said, that will be your ideal, and how that coincides with the role of being a curator, of making selection, of making some kind of narrative, or make a presentation. Those are all selections choices that you have to make in what you present. So how can that ever be an open book?
Well, let's say I had chosen 10 books for you to read. Are they not open books anymore because I chose them? Well, but each work is. I mean, I think there's a wonderful text by Umberto Eco from a book he wrote called The Open Work. This is from 1962, but I think it's still as relevant as it was in 1962. And he's really describing the qualities of art that create this idea of an open text. Now this, to me though, this doesn't mean that I could still argue with somebody that, you know, I think you're misreading this work, okay? It doesn't mean that you cannot try to justify why you think your reading is more compelling and maybe more precise. But I think, for me, most interesting artworks aren't trying to create one meaning or one iconic structure. They're trying to set up chains of associations and ideas, and there are slippages between those chains. And for me, the way I judge the quality of an artwork is how complex the resonance is between all those different references and associations. What, you know, I mean, if it's very simple, I know it's not going to stay with me for a long time. But if that network of linkages and associations that an art world can set up is quite resonant and complex, I can never fully resolve that work. And then I can't stop thinking about it. You know, it's like one of those things in life where it just stays with you because you're having to keep working through it.
Sí, hola, ¿qué tal? Bueno, es muy interesante, muy rica tu
Very
pensamiento.
interesting. Your thought is
Tengo muchas
so
preguntas,
rich,
pero voy a
and I
tratar de
have so many
focalizar en
questions,
la
but I
relación con
will
la audiencia,
focus
la relación
on the
con,
relation with the
con el
audience, if
público
I
al que está
may, with the
dirigido
public,
la Bienal. Y
those
una
that
es
you
un
are
poco más
addressing the
expectativas
Bienniale
personales, o
with.
sea, ¿cuál es la Bienal
Personal
soñada para vos?
interpretations.
¿Qué es
What's
lo que
your
te
dream
gustaría
Bienniale?
que ocurra desde el
What
punto de vista
would
de alguien
you
que
want to happen
gesta,
on a
que la piensa,
person?
que
Because
la
you are
construye, ¿no?
conceiving
Con
and
otros,
building
con esta complejidad. Y
this
otra,
complex
si
being,
dentro del
and
espacio
how
de
would
la
you like
Bienal
others
queda
to
ese
interpret
espacio
it?
secreto,
And within the Bienniale, there's
digamos,
always a
de la
secret
persona que va a
space,
disfrutar de la obra,
a
o se
person
pierde
just
en ese contexto, en
enjoying
esa bulla,
the
en
work,
esa, de alguna manera,
lost in the
interjuegos, intersecciones de intereses,
interplay
etcétera,
and
etcétera.
intersection of interests and so many other things.
Thank you for that question. I do think getting lost is a very important part of our experience of art. And so maybe my dream Biennale involves getting lost a little bit. But rather than getting overwhelmed, I think they're very different experiences. You know, there's so many different ways that we can do these biennales, and one of the first things I looked at when I was appointed was, can I take the transport budget and put it all towards production and invite 80 artists to live in Venice for 2 months and make all the work in Venice as a community. And that's a Biennale I would like to see someday. In Venice, it actually turns out to be much more expensive. But there are parts of the world where the hotels aren't so expensive, where it would be possible to do that Biennale. And I was in the Biennale in Dakar in Senegal last spring, and I really thought this is the perfect place for this approach because there's no climate control in the venues. A lot of the work has customs troubles and gets lost coming in or going back. So why not have a Biennale that's totally site-specific, ephemeral work that can be destroyed after the Biennale is over, recycled. And that's this moment that would just exist. So I think rather than themes, there's so much more interesting work to be done thinking about different formats. And I will present a different format for this Biennale, but I'm not talking about it yet.
Hola, hola. Sí, yo te quería preguntar cómo tu
I would
experiencia
like to
como
know
curador de la
your
Bienal de
experience
Lyon
as a curator of the
cambió
Lyon
tu forma de pensar las
Biennale.
bienales
How
y
did
las
that
curadurías
change
de
your
bienales,
idea of
y cómo
biennales
pensás que eso va a
and
influenciar tu forma
curatorship?
de
How
pensar
will
la
that
curaduría en la Bienal de
influence
Venecia,
your
siendo también
work
dos
at
formatos muy
Venice?
distintos
Because the
en dos
two
ciudades
biennales are different
con un público
formats,
muy
two
diferente.
different cities, very different audiences.
Lyon Biennale is got one thing in common with Venice that's very interesting, is it has two venues that are the primary venues. One is an industrial building, and the other is a museum building. Venice is the same thing. Big industrial building and a museum-type building. And I think what I learned in Lyon is that the character of the buildings unavoidably changes the way the art feels and looks and works in that space. So that definitely made me think, okay, I'm not going to pretend Venice is, the two venues are interchangeable. So then there's only one logical place to go, but I'm not going to discuss that yet.
¿Han quedado todos mudos?
You're all quiet now.
No, no hay más cuestiones ni más preguntas.
No more comments or questions
Yo voy a
from the
agregar algo
audience?
que viene.
I'm very interested in why are we so interested in biennales? Because there's an interesting philosopher, Cornelius Castoriadis, okay, who really wrote that in this kind of period of hyperconsumption, that the normal consumption value of art has changed. That going to the museum doesn't have the same thrill that we want when we want consumption, right? We want it to feel like this is a special event that's only happening right now, and it's only on for this much time. And so that the time-based nature of an exhibition became much more important. And I do think this is an interesting thing about biennales, that they present themselves as events as much as exhibitions. They define themselves by their temporal coordinates, right? It's every 2 years. You're going to have to wait a long time if you miss this one. Because I'm kind of amazed at how much interest there is in biennales. And I was in Gwangju in Korea for a biennale, and it's very interesting. Gwangju is not a town that's a super cultural hub. It's a real working city. But because of this biennale, I was getting lost all the time. And I don't speak Korean, but all I had to do was say the word biennale, and everyone would know what I was talking about and could point me in the right location. So I suddenly thought, my God, this has become this strange Esperanto, this word biennale, that wherever you are in the world, you can just say biennale and someone will point you somewhere.
Yo quería preguntar que para esta Bienal,
Well,
¿qué
I
se tomó
wanted
en
to
cuenta
ask,
de
for
las
this
obras, o
Biennale,
sea,
what are you
para ser
considering
seleccionadas?
in the works for selecting them?
I think considering really what I was talking about when I said what I value most is this complexity of the resonance between the different types of associations that can come out of one work. That all the different possible connecting thoughts that one work can generate as a trigger. And I mean, I think one of the things that art helps us do is to make different kinds of connections between things, between forms, ideas, histories. And that's what really creative thinking is. It's not coming up with new ideas, but figuring out new ways to connect things that already exist. So work that has that capacity, always what I'm interested in.
Buenas tardes, Ralph.
Good afternoon, Ralph.
Bueno, gracias por la presentación.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Más que una pregunta, sería un comentario.
I don't think mine is a question.
Me pareció muy pertinente,
Maybe a
muy
comment.
importante
I think it's really relevant,
hablar sobre las
important
noticias
to
falsas, de
speak
las
of fake news now.
en todo el continente, en todo el mundo. Pero en todo el
In the
continente
world,
latinoamericano,
in the Latin
estamos viendo
American
cómo, a partir de la
area,
utilización de los
we
medios
see
masivos de
how the
comunicación,
mass media
también lo hago un comentario desde el lugar de haber vivido como artista,
use fake news. Myself as an artist have been a victim of fake news, and it's terrible. It's so difficult for the world of art to understand this conflict between using artistic creative resources to generate distortions that enable polarization to right-wing fascism, manipulation of elections. So, considering that, I'm curious, how can we use the Venice Bienniale as a platform, as a space for counteracting symbolically the expansion of fake news, because this is a global, highly visible international forum, but it's also a diplomatic forum as well.
I think I don't, yeah, it's interesting. Somehow when you, because this is how this was translated for me, that how do you use the Venice Biennale? And when I heard that, I immediately thought, you're going down the wrong path if you think you're going to use it to accomplish some goal. But maybe that wasn't the right translation. No.
No, it's how to, well, maybe it's not to use the display of the Biennale, but the possibility to show up or to make visible some things which will be not taken by the art system, sometimes escaping from that point of view because it's more part of the political life than the bubble of the culture. In that way, my question is, if it's possible, it's a challenge, I don't know, to work on the platform of the Biennial, which is an international exhibition with many countries involved. I mentioned the diplomatic system as well, but as a point of visibility for certain issues which are not clear when we eat from the mass media, wherever, in UK, the States, or here.
I mean, I love exhibitions as a format for thinking. But I've never been under the impression that it was a mass medium. You can use an exhibition certainly to have incredibly interesting conversations. And I hope, say, that Venice will bring together some artists who are having I think, very interesting, provocative thoughts and questions around these issues. where does it go from there? You know, I think the next level of diffusion is through the national press and media and the international press. So that discussion ends up being filtered through these other perspectives from the media, which is always commenting on itself anyway. So there's a direct experience that the 600,000 people, or however many it will be, will come and have some experience. But I also think it's important to keep alive a certain understanding of art, because every time, it's interesting, politicians often use the idea of a crisis to give themselves emergency powers, right? Or to scare people into voting for extreme repressive policies. This is standard operating procedure. And I'm a little worried that maybe in the art world, curators who claimed that we're in the midst of a crisis where it's so bad, there's no place for art anymore, right? How can we engage in these trivial aesthetic and intellectual issues when we're destroying the planet and people are being exploited left and right? Horrible injustices are happening. Democracy is dying all over the world. So what is the role of art in that kind of a moment? As much as I feel it's so important to resist those things, I don't want to put art in a box where that's the only thing it can do. Because I think the danger for me with a lot of political art is it stops being an open text, because it's trying to communicate one message and one point of view. And to me, the wonderful politics of art that I love are the openness of how it communicates. But that openness can seem like a luxury if you feel you're at a time of crisis. So I'm worried about the crisis card that you play. And, you know, I've read a lot of statements from biennales around the world in the last 10 years. And in so many of them, the word art isn't mentioned until you come to the third page, because it's all about different political issues that, you know, we need to get straight, and this is wrong with the world and that's wrong with the world. And I don't kid myself that I'm in a position to change that. And I think the powers of art to change that are constrained and limited. But they can for some people, and I think that's important. But I don't want to, I want art to be the center of the experience. You know, there's a wonderful Swiss artist named Thomas Hirschhorn, who I have a lot of respect for, who says that he doesn't make political art, he makes art politically. And I think maybe that's a good thought to end with.
Yes, thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so
Me
much.
parece que estas últimas
I think that the last few
afirmaciones
statements
son un buen cierre
are
para
a
este
good
intercambio.
ending for this exchange.
Estas últimas
The last few
palabras son un
statements
buen
that you
cierre para el
pronounced are a
intercambio,
good
especialmente
ending
ya
for
que,
our exchange. because this tension between art and politics many times gets solved, as you were saying. This tension gets solved by shortening up the space taken by art and reinforcing politics, and that is not the way. Maybe by working on art, by generating experiences, spaces of artistic experience, it is impossible to reinvent some terms of political discussion. And even though it may sound utopic, it might be worthwhile thinking about this along these lines. I think that maybe so we can stop our discussion here and we can leave it open so that people can take a chance and watch the results of your work in Venice in May 2019, as long as you agree with that.